All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into one of the most well-known conflicts, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
Yeah, in 2024.
specifically in 2024. And we're going beyond like the headlines, what we see on cable news or whatever, and we're really looking at the human impact of the conflict.
Exactly.
And so the source that we're going to be looking at is excerpts from Wikipedia's timeline of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2024.
That's right.
And I'm really excited to go through this with you.
Yeah. You know what's so interesting about this timeline is just how raw it is.
Yeah.
It's like reading a day-to-day account, almost like a diary entry of the conflict. It's
Right.
really powerful.
Yeah, and just looking at, just glancing at it, even in January, like the sheer amount of entries is very sobering.
Yeah.
Over 29,000 Palestinian deaths reported by the Gaza Health Ministry in just the month of January.
It's a staggering number.
Yeah.
And when you think about the fact that a significant number of those casualties were children,
Oh, yeah.
it really hits home the devastating impact.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, of course, that the timeline also records the deaths of Israeli soldiers.
Right.
This conflict affects both sides.
Absolutely.
It's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Yeah. And just reading through some of these entries, certain incidents really just jump out at you, like just how brutal this conflict was.
Yeah.
For example, the assassination of Hamas deputy leader Salah al-Aruri in Beirut.
Right.
Or the bombing of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society headquarters.
Each entry is a story of loss.
Yeah.
Families torn apart, lives lost.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the deaths of Israeli soldiers. But another example is 21 Israeli soldiers died when a building collapsed in January as well.
Right. And then you have incidents like the deaths of civilians fleeing Nasser Hospital.
Yeah.
The timeline suggests they were caught in Israeli tank and drone fire. Just a horrible situation.
And it's not just direct combat that's taking lives.
Right.
The timeline even mentions airdropped aid packages meant for Rafah. That actually ended up crushing and killing people.
It's a tragic irony
It really is.
that even aid efforts can become so dangerous in this kind of environment.
Yeah, like it makes you wonder, in such a desperate situation, how can aid even be delivered safely?
Exactly.
It's a really tough question.
And this brings us to another critical issue that emerges from the timeline.
Yeah.
The vulnerability of the healthcare system in Gaza.
Right.
Hospitals like Nasser Medical Complex and Al Amal Hospital are constantly under siege.
Yeah.
They're running out of vital resources, food, fuel, you name it.
Yeah, it's a cycle that you see repeated throughout this timeline.
Right.
Any kind of escalation in the conflict, it just directly impacts the healthcare infrastructure, which is already incredibly strained.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you see shortages of essential medical supplies, chronically ill patients struggling to get dialysis.
It's a desperate situation.
It really is. And that's where the role of these international organizations comes in.
That's right.
Groups like the World Health Organization, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders.
They're trying to fill the gaps.
Yeah, they're doing what they can, but even they are facing huge challenges.
Absolutely. The timeline mentions the besieging of multiple hospitals by Israeli forces.
Yeah, including Al-Shifa Hospital.
It just highlights the difficulty of providing aid in such a volatile environment.
Right, and then you have the controversy surrounding the aid itself.
Yes.
The timeline mentions allegations of UNRWA employees being involved in Hamas activity.
Right.
Which, further complicates the situation.
Of course.
Raises questions about, is the aid neutral?
Exactly.
Can it be delivered effectively?
Real tough questions.
Yeah, and then also in January, the timeline mentions the Al-Rashid humanitarian aid incident, where 118 Palestinian civilians died.
Wow.
And so it just shows how, even with the best of intentions,
Yeah.
things can go wrong very quickly.
Absolutely.
With such a volatile environment.
It's a constant risk.
So moving beyond the immediate conflict zone, the timeline also reveals some pretty strong reactions from the international community. One example is South Africa accusing Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice.
That's a big statement.
It is. And then you also have countries like France imposing travel bans on Israeli settlers who were accused of violence.
So you're seeing a range of responses.
Yeah.
From condemnation to actual concrete actions.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have the U.S. vetoing a UN ceasefire resolution.
Right.
So, if you connect that to the bigger picture of U.S.-Israel relations, it just illustrates how complex this situation is.
Absolutely.
And how difficult it is to achieve a unified international response.
There are so many layers of political and historical baggage.
Yeah, it's a real mess.
It really is.
And then, within this larger context, the timeline also points to wider regional instability as well.
Yeah.
We see Iran deploying a warship to the Red Sea,
Right.
Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
It's a reminder that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's part of a much larger web of regional tensions.
Right. And the timeline even mentions the U.S. and the U.K. conducting airstrikes in Yemen.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how these conflicts can intertwine and potentially escalate,
Absolutely.
like a ripple effect.
Yeah, one event can trigger a chain reaction across the whole region.
Yeah, and in the midst of all this, it's really easy to lose sight of the individuals whose lives are being directly impacted.
That's where this timeline is so valuable, I think.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the human reality of the conflict.
Yeah, we can't just get bogged down in statistics and, these military maneuvers.
Right.
We need to understand what life was like for the people who are caught in the crossfire,
Absolutely.
especially, those living under siege in Gaza.
The timeline gives us glimpses into that daily life.
Yeah.
The deaths of children, families fleeing their homes, the constant fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
It paints a very vivid picture.
Yeah, and one entry that I found particularly impactful was about 6-year-old Hind Rajab.
Oh, yes.
She was the sole survivor of Israeli tank fire on her family's vehicle,
Oh, my goodness.
but was later found dead.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, and, it's these personal tragedies that
Right.
really bring home the human cost of this conflict.
They remind us that behind the statistics are real people.
Yeah.
With families and dreams and lives that are being shattered.
And, the timeline gives us even more examples of these gut-wrenching accounts,
Yeah.
like the deaths of Palestinian children from starvation in Kamal Adwan Hospital,
Oh,
or the killing of 5 Palestinian journalists by an Israeli airstrike.
These are just numbers. These are human lives.
Yeah.
Tragically cut short.
And it's a stark reminder that beyond the political rhetoric and, all the military strategies,
Yeah.
there are real people enduring unimaginable suffering.
Absolutely.
And this is happening on both sides of the conflict.
You're right.
The timeline also offers a glimpse into the internal political landscapes of both Israel and Palestine.
Yes.
For example, we see protests in Tel Aviv demanding the release of Hamas captives and Netanyahu's resignation. And then on the Palestinian side, we see Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh resigning, citing the genocide in Gaza.
So you see how the conflict creates these internal pressures and divisions.
Yeah.
It's not just about the two sides. It's also about the divisions within each society.
Yeah, and it's a multi-layered conflict
Right.
with deep historical roots.
Absolutely.
And the events of 2024, as documented in this timeline,
Yeah.
are really just one chapter.
In a long and complicated story.
This has been a really eye-opening exploration so far.
Yes, it has.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
from the escalating violence and the tragic loss of life
Yeah.
to the struggles of the healthcare system
Right.
and the international community's response.
But there's still so much more to uncover in this timeline.
Yeah, there is.
So in the next part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
we're going to delve deeper into these stories of resilience,
Yeah.
resistance,
Okay.
and this ongoing quest for peace amidst all the chaos and suffering.
I'm really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think you'll find it fascinating.
All right, so we'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into this timeline.
As we dig deeper into February in this timeline, you really start to see a recurring theme.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
This growing sense of desperation, especially in Gaza.
Yeah.
The healthcare system was just barely hanging on.
Right.
Hospitals like Al-Shifa basically under siege.
Yeah.
The timeline mentions instances where hospitals had to make these impossible choices
Yeah.
about who to prioritize for treatment.
Right.
They just didn't have the supplies.
Wow.
Can you imagine being a doctor in that situation?
Oh, gosh, no.
Having to tell a patient you can't help them because you don't have the resources.
It's just heartbreaking.
And it wasn't just healthcare. The crisis extended to food as well.
Yeah.
The timeline details severe food shortages.
Yeah, reports of people dying from starvation, even children.
The UNRWA director even accused Israel of blocking food supplies
Oh, wow.
to over 1 million Palestinians in Gaza. That blockade, combined with the fighting,
Yeah.
created a really dire situation.
It must have felt like being trapped with no way out.
Absolutely.
Reading these entries really gives you a sense of what life under siege was like.
Yeah, that constant fear, the lack of basic necessities,
Yeah.
the feeling of being completely forgotten by the outside world.
It's really heavy.
And yet, amidst all that suffering, you also see these incredible stories of resilience and resistance.
Right.
There are entries about Palestinians in Gaza organizing protests,
Yeah.
demanding food and aid,
Wow.
even when they face the threat of violence.
Pretty powerful.
Those acts of defiance are incredible.
Yeah, even when facing such overwhelming odds, they refuse to be silenced.
They still had hope for a better future.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit.
It really is, and it wasn't just the Palestinians themselves.
Right.
The timeline also highlights the role of international organizations,
Yeah.
trying to provide support, often putting themselves in incredibly dangerous situations.
Yeah, and the timeline mentions those World Central KitchenAid workers
Yes,
who were killed when their vehicles were destroyed in Gaza.
a tragic reminder of the risks.
Yeah, that one really got to me.
Their dedication and sacrifice were remarkable.
It really highlights the challenges and dangers faced by those working in conflict zones.
Yeah, in these environments, even those trying to deliver humanitarian aid can become targets.
As we move into March and April in the timeline, it's clear the violence wasn't letting up.
Right, the casualty numbers kept rising, and the situation in Gaza remained critical.
Yeah, hospitals struggling, basic services still disrupted.
But there's an interesting shift in focus around this time.
Oh, really?
We see more entries related to the West Bank,
Okay.
highlighting that the conflict wasn't confined to Gaza.
Right.
There are reports of Israeli raids, clashes with Palestinian militants, and continued settler violence.
It's a crucial reminder that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so much bigger than any one event or location.
Exactly. It has these deep historical and political roots. And the events in Gaza were just one part of this larger ongoing struggle.
We're talking about decades of conflict here.
The timeline also documents developments on the international stage.
Right.
For instance, the International Court of Justice issued a ruling ordering Israel to prevent genocide in Gaza.
That's a pretty big deal, isn't it?
It is, but it's important to note that the court didn't order a ceasefire.
Oh, okay.
It shows the limitations of international law in such a complex conflict.
Right, because you've got all these different actors involved.
Exactly. And we also see the U.S. continuing to veto UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah, that seems to be a pattern.
It highlights the difficulty of finding a diplomatic solution.
Right, because there are such strong divisions within the international community.
It's this constant push and pull,
Yeah.
calls for peace are met with renewed violence and hardening of positions.
It feels like a cycle that just keeps repeating.
Unfortunately, it often does.
Reading through the timeline, you almost get the sense that this conflict just defies resolution,
It's a really tough situation.
despite the immense human cost.
And as we move into the later months of 2024, there's a noticeable shift.
Oh, yeah. How so?
The entries become less detailed, less frequent.
Hmm.
OCHA, the UN's humanitarian agency, even switches from daily flash updates to less frequent situation reports.
It's like the world's attention is waning.
Almost as if people are becoming desensitized to the suffering.
It makes you wonder if the frequency of reporting influences how we perceive conflicts.
That's an interesting point.
Does it become less important, less urgent if it's not constantly in the headlines?
It's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, food for thought.
And despite this shift in reporting, the timeline still reveals moments of incredible tragedy and resilience.
Right, because the conflict didn't just disappear.
Exactly.
For example, the story of Aaron Bushnell, the U.S. Air Force serviceman who set himself on fire
Oh, yes.
in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C.
To protest the war.
It was such a desperate act.
A profound sense of moral outrage.
Yeah, you can really feel the emotional toll this conflict takes.
Even on those not directly involved.
And then on a completely different note, you also see the strength and resilience of the Palestinian people.
Absolutely.
Like, despite everything they faced, the people of Gaza continued to find ways to resist, to rebuild, to hold on to hope.
The timeline mentions the work of organizations like Doctors Without Borders,
Yeah.
who continued to provide medical care
Right.
in incredibly difficult circumstances.
And there are accounts of Palestinian journalists risking their lives to document the truth.
Even as their colleagues were being killed in airstrikes.
Those acts of courage and compassion are truly inspiring.
They remind us that even in the darkest of times, humanity can shine through.
Yeah, they do. And it's those flickers of hope, those acts of resistance that we'll continue to explore.
Absolutely.
As we move into the final part of our deep dive into this timeline,
Looking forward to it.
as we get into the second half of 2024 in this timeline, it almost feels like we're moving into a new phase of the conflict.
Yeah, you could say that the intensity of the fighting maybe seemed to die down a bit, but the timeline shows the underlying issues were far from resolved.
Right, and the human cost was still climbing.
Absolutely.
The entries are definitely more sporadic, but they still offer those glimpses into, the resilience of the people, the ongoing struggle, and of course, the always shifting political
For
landscape.
sure. For example, the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza in October.
Yeah, that was huge. He was a major figure in Hamas.
Absolutely. His death definitely raised questions about the future of Hamas and the possibility of either further escalation or maybe even a shift in the power dynamics within Gaza.
It's like someone took a piece off the chessboard. Now everyone's trying to figure out what happens next.
A good analogy.
Yeah.
And even though the world's attention might have been elsewhere, the timeline reminds us that the conflict continued to claim lives.
Right, like those attacks in October and December, the shooting by Jordanian terrorists in Israel, and the airstrike at the Nusrat refugee camp that killed 5 Palestinian journalists.
Exactly. It's easy to focus on the big events, the political stuff, but it's sometimes the smaller incidents, the ones that don't even make it into a timeline like this, that really tell the story.
It's a reminder that behind every event we see here, there were countless others. Acts of violence, daily struggles, personal tragedies that we'll never know about.
Exactly. It's so important to resist that urge to simplify this conflict, to try to fit it into neat narratives or sound bites.
This timeline, despite its limitations, really helps to personalize the conflict. It reminds us that this is ultimately about people, individuals caught in this seemingly endless cycle of violence and suffering.
It challenges us to grapple with the complexities, to understand the nuances, and most importantly, to acknowledge the very real human cost.
Yeah, as we come to the end of this deep dive, I'm honestly left feeling incredibly saddened by all the loss and the suffering. But I also feel this renewed sense of responsibility to learn more, to keep trying to understand, and to do what I can to amplify the voices of those who are so often ignored and forgotten.
I think that's the key takeaway here. Peace in this region is still a long way off. The timeline shows us that. But it also points to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the hope for a better future, and all those people who are working so hard to build bridges and promote understanding.
This deep dive has been a huge reminder for me that we can't just turn away from this conflict. We can't let ourselves become numb to the suffering.
Absolutely. We have a responsibility to stay informed, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to support those efforts to create a more just and peaceful future for everyone.
It's a complex challenge, but the stakes are just too high to ignore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a new perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that it encourages you to keep learning and engaging with this complex issue.